Hello everyone and welcome back. Tonight, we're taking a deep dive into the quietest corners of Oregon, where the forests seem peaceful, but beneath their stillness lie stories most towns prefer to forget. In this episode, we'll uncover 9 true accounts of crime and disappearance that have haunted rural communities for decades. Each story has been carefully reconstructed from investigation notes, archived police records, and the words of those who lived to tell what happened. Some of these cases remain open. Others were quietly closed without answers. To protect the privacy of those involved, certain names and exact locations have been altered. If you're new here, subscribe for real stories that reach into the darkness just beyond the edge of everyday life. Ethan had worked at a manufacturing plant outside Salem for nearly 8 years. It wasn't an exciting job. He operated a precision milling machine in a warehouse that always smelled faintly of oil and metal dust. His co-workers were quiet men who showed up, did their hours, and went home without conversation. The facility itself was forgettable. Gray walls, chain-link fences, and acres of Oregon forest pressing in on every side. After a bitter divorce, routine became the only structure holding Ethan's life together. He worked the same shift, ate the same sandwich for lunch, and drove the same route home each evening. His apartment was bare, a one-bedroom rental with second-hand furniture and a TV that stayed off more than it was on. His weekends were reserved for his daughter, though his custody arrangement rarely let him see her for long. It was a Thursday in early autumn when things began to unravel. A late shipment had arrived, and Ethan was asked to stay past his shift to process it. The task was simple: move the inventory into a climate-controlled storage unit, log it, and leave the paperwork for the next day's supervisor. He'd done it dozens of times. But that night, as he lifted one of the boxes from a pallet, the cardboard gave way. The crate hit the concrete floor with a heavy thud, splitting open along a seam. Ethan froze. From inside spilled several clear plastic bags filled with a crystalline white substance that glittered under the fluorescent light. His stomach dropped. He'd worked long enough around industrial chemicals to know this wasn't anything the plant should be handling. He glanced toward the corner of the room. The small red lights on the security cameras, usually blinking steadily, were off. The warehouse door was closed. He was completely alone. His first instinct was to tell someone, maybe the floor supervisor. But before he could take a step, the warehouse door opened. Marcus, his supervisor, stepped in. Behind him were 2 men Ethan had never seen before. They didn't look like anyone who worked there: clean shirts, confident posture, eyes that scanned the room like they already knew what they'd find. Marcus stopped when he saw the open box. His expression tightened, but he said nothing. One of the strangers knelt, examined the contents, then stood and looked at Ethan. His face was calm, but his voice carried a weight that froze the air. "You shouldn't have seen this," he said. Ethan stammered, I didn't mean to." The man raised a hand, silencing him. "People who make mistakes like this," he continued, "tend to have bad luck. Work accidents, car accidents. Sometimes those accidents involve their families." He paused. Then he said Ethan's daughter's name. He mentioned her school, her teacher, the park near her mother's apartment in Portland. The details were precise, too precise. Ethan felt his knees weaken. The man stepped closer, his tone still calm. "You're going to keep your job. You'll keep doing exactly what you do now. But when certain deliveries arrive, you'll handle them quietly. No records, no questions, no conversations. In return, you'll be compensated, generously." He slipped a small card across the table. "There'll be an account in your name. You'll see the first deposit by morning. Follow instructions and you'll have nothing to worry about. Try to talk to anyone, and the accidents begin. Ethan nodded, not because he agreed, but because he didn't know what else to do. His mouth moved before his mind caught up, saying, "I understand." The men left. Marcus followed without a word. Ethan stood alone beside the sealed box, his pulse hammering in his ears. By the next morning there was a new deposit in his bank account, 5 times his weekly pay. And the cameras that had gone dark were suddenly working again. Over the next 8 months, Ethan became part of something he didn't understand. Every few weeks, unmarked trucks arrived after hours. Marcus supervised silently, while Ethan moved sealed crates into restricted storage. The same men appeared occasionally, never speaking more than necessary, never staying long. Ethan began to notice patterns. Some shipments were heavier. Others emitted faint chemical odors. He memorized a few labels, and one night, unable to help himself, searched them online. Each one led to substances tied to synthetic drug manufacturing. Illegal. Dangerous. He started sleeping less. His hands trembled at work. He unplugged his phone at night, convinced someone was listening. Then, one evening, Marcus didn't show up for his shift. The trucks still arrived, and one of the same 2 strangers stepped out, this time wearing a company badge that looked freshly printed. "Marcus isn't here," Ethan said. "He's not needed," the man replied. "Move the shipment." Ethan obeyed. Halfway through, the distant flash of red and blue lights flickered across the warehouse windows. For a moment, he thought it was over, the police, maybe a raid, but the lights vanished as quickly as they appeared, turning down another road. The man's phone rang. He answered instantly. "They're close," he said quietly. "Tell them to stand down." His voice dropped to a whisper Ethan couldn't make out. When he hung up, he turned to Ethan. "You didn't call them, did you?" Ethan shook his head. "No." The man stared for a long moment before speaking again. "Good. Because if you did, this would be your last shift." The next morning, Marcus's locker was empty. HR said he'd been transferred. No one spoke about it again. Weeks passed. The extra deposits stopped. The special shipments ended. The warehouse went back to normal. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. But Ethan never slept properly again. He'd wake to sounds in his hallway that stopped the moment he moved. Cars idled outside his apartment longer than necessary. He'd catch glimpses of people watching him from across the street, only for them to disappear when he looked twice. Then one day, Ethan didn't show up for work. His supervisor called twice, then stopped. His landlord found his apartment unlocked, the lights off, his wallet and phone still on the table. The only thing missing was Ethan himself. To this day, no one knows where he went. Some believe he finally ran, leaving Oregon for good. Others think the men who visited that warehouse came back to clean up loose ends. But late at night, when the wind moves through the trees behind the old plant, workers still say they hear a faint sound, a single box falling to the floor, and the echo of a man whispering that he shouldn't have seen what was inside. The shipments kept coming. Bags of white powder, sealed tight in layers of plastic and tape, passed through the warehouse under the cover of night. Methamphetamine, fentanyl, other synthetic compounds that didn't even have names. Evan didn't ask questions anymore. The trucks arrived, he signed nothing, and the crates disappeared into storage before dawn. He had learned to separate his mind from what his hands were doing. He wasn't moving drugs, he told himself. He was just moving boxes. That lie became his only form of survival. The equation was simple. Stay quiet, stay alive, keep his daughter safe. But even the strongest walls inside a mind begin to crack. By the 7th month, the silence around him shifted. One night, Marcus introduced a new visitor to the plant, a man named Daniel. Unlike the others, Daniel didn't wear the same cold expression. He smiled easily, spoke casually, and acted as though the illegal shipments were nothing more than routine logistics. Daniel asked Evan questions, not about work, about his life, his daughter, his divorce, his plans for the future. The conversation felt strange, too intimate, as if Daniel was testing him. Then, in the middle of it, Daniel said something that froze him in place. "We're expanding the network," Daniel said, "and you might be useful in a bigger role." Evan stared at him. "I don't want a bigger role." Daniel chuckled, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "That's what people with conscience say. But conscience is a problem in our line of work. People with conscience start thinking about right and wrong instead of what needs to be done. They make mistakes, dangerous ones." He leaned in closer. "You can't afford mistakes, Evan. Not with a daughter who still walks home from school alone." Evan felt something inside him shift. A mental line he hadn't known existed, suddenly visible. On one side was the man who'd been forced into this life, the hostage who obeyed out of fear. On the other side was something darker, a man who chose to stay, who became part of the machinery instead of resisting it. Daniel was inviting him to cross that line permanently. Evan refused. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I've done what you asked. I want out." Daniel's face didn't change, but the warmth vanished from his eyes. "There is no out," he said softly. "There's forward, or there's gone. You don't get to just walk away. You've seen too much. Too many people know your name. You're either useful, or you disappear." 3 days later, Evan drove to the Federal Building in Portland and walked into the FBI field office. He asked to speak to an agent who handled drug cases. When they brought him into a conference room, he told them everything. He gave names, shipment schedules, account details, and storage locations. He explained the threats, the coercion, the men who knew where his daughter lived. He didn't ask for protection. He asked to help stop it. The agents listened, skeptical at first. But when Evan agreed to wear a hidden recorder at work, the tone changed. They started taking notes. Over the next 4 months, the FBI worked quietly alongside local police and the DEA. They followed the trucks, tracked deposits, and watched the late-night transfers. Every move Evan made inside the facility was recorded. Every box, every crate, every whispered conversation. When they finally moved in, it happened all at once. Raids across 3 states, warehouses sealed, properties searched, and more than 20 arrests made in a single night. The plant where Evan worked was declared a federal crime scene by morning. Marcus was among those taken into custody. Daniel wasn't. He had vanished. Evan was placed in protective custody as the investigation deepened. The agents told him the network was far bigger than they'd realized. The facility had been one node in a regional supply chain connected to an international syndicate. The structure was deliberately fractured so that no single person could see the whole picture. Even Daniel, it turned out, answered to people whose identities were still unknown. The trial that followed dragged on for more than a year. Evan testified multiple times, walking into the courtroom under escort and leaving through a separate exit each day. Defense attorneys tried to destroy his credibility, calling him a collaborator who was only testifying to save himself. They played recordings out of context, suggesting that he'd stayed in the operation willingly. At one point, prosecutors showed photos of overdose victims, people killed by the same substances that had moved through Evans' warehouse. The defense attorney placed the images in front of him one by one and asked if he felt responsible. Evans' answer was simple. Yes. He said he lived with that weight every day, that he'd been part of something that destroyed lives, and he'd never stop carrying that guilt. But he also said he hadn't been free to choose, that he'd been forced through fear, through the threat of harm to his child. And when the moment came to act, he did what he could to stop it. The courtroom stayed silent. Of the 23 people arrested, 21 were convicted. 2 received reduced charges in exchange for their testimony. Sentences ranged from 8 years to 22. Marcus, the supervisor who had first brought the strangers into the facility, was given 20 years. Daniel was never caught. The FBI believes he escaped the country before the first raid, possibly to Mexico or further south. His trail vanished completely after the arrests. When the case ended, Evan was relocated under a new identity through the Federal Witness Protection Program. The name on his driver's license is not his own. He lives several hours from his old town, working quietly in a job arranged by the program. Low profile, steady, far from attention. He doesn't contact his daughter often, though nothing in the agreement forbids it. It's his own choice. He believes that keeping his distance keeps her safer. He sends money through intermediaries every month for her education, but he never calls, never visits. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he drives to the edge of the forest near his new home and parks there with the headlights off. He listens to the wind moving through the trees and the faint hum of distant machinery, and for a moment he feels the same fear that ruled his life for nearly a year. Somewhere out there, men like Daniel are still operating, faceless, patient, and invisible. And though Evan's name is gone, the memory of those nights in the warehouse never leaves him. He knows that somewhere in Oregon, under the cover of those dark pines, boxes are still being moved. And someone else is standing where he once stood, alone, afraid, and whispering the same lie to survive. I'm just moving boxes. James still dreams of the warehouse. The lights hum above him, the air smells of chemical dust, and the shipments never end. In the dream, his daughter is somewhere inside the facility, calling for him, but he can never find her. Marcus and David stand in the shadows, watching. He understands then that the trial never happened, that every testimony and verdict was only a wish for absolution. This, right here, is where the consequences begin. He has learned to live with those dreams. He has learned to live with guilt that never softens, with a conscience that no longer protects him. He knows the truth. Some wounds are not healed by survival. They simply become quiet enough to ignore. Safety, once broken, is only an imitation of the real thing. He knows someone could remember his face at any moment, and that remembering could end everything. Olivia had never met James. Their stories would never cross except through the same empty Oregon highways that swallow people whole. She was 28, a photographer whose life existed between stretches of asphalt and the quiet light of forgotten places. She worked in a Seattle office to pay for the trips that defined her. Each weekend, she packed her camera, tripod, and a change of clothes into her aging Civic and drove toward isolation. Her goal was always the same: to capture the beauty of places most people overlooked. In October, she left for southern Oregon, planning to photograph the migrating birds along Upper Klamath Lake. She called her mother from Bend, said she'd arrive by evening, and was gone. The last record of her existence was a coffee purchase in a small station near the town of Chemult. The clerk remembered her clearly, friendly, curious, asking for directions to a good overlook. He told her about a Forest Service road 15 miles south, a place with perfect light. Olivia thanked him, drove away, and vanished. When she didn't arrive, her mother, Patricia, began calling every hospital and sheriff's office along her route. That same night, she filed a missing person report in Klamath County. The search started the next morning. Deputies followed her expected path, but her phone was off, her credit cards unused, and her car absent from every camera. Patricia refused to wait. 3 days later, she drove to Oregon herself, tracing her daughter's route mile by mile. She found the gas station, spoke to the same clerk, then followed the narrow road he'd mentioned. It wound through thick forest until it opened onto a small clearing, a crude overlook with space for 3 cars and no guardrail. The ground dropped steeply into a wooded ravine 200 feet deep. Standing at the edge, Patricia understood why Olivia had wanted to photograph this place. The light was haunting, the silence absolute. She also understood how easily someone, or something, could disappear here. She called the sheriff's office again. Search teams came with helicopters and dogs. For 5 days they scoured the ravine and surrounding forest. They found nothing. No wreckage, no footprints, no trace of the young woman who'd driven there. Weeks became months. The case went cold. Officials suggested she might have crashed in a remote area or chosen to leave her life behind. Patricia didn't believe it. Her daughter was disciplined, predictable in her communication. Disappearance wasn't in her nature. She returned to Oregon again and again. She drove every side road along Route 97, spoke to gas station attendants, rangers, and long-haul drivers. She hired private investigators, posted flyers, and created online forums for tips. What she found disturbed her deeply. Between 2015 and 2023, 7 other people, 4 women and 3 men, had disappeared along the same highway under nearly identical circumstances. All had been traveling alone during daylight. All had last been seen at rural stations or roadside shops. None of their vehicles were ever recovered. None of the cases were solved. Patricia compiled everything into a detailed report: names, dates, maps, and photos of the missing. She sent it to the FBI's Portland field office, requesting they examine the cases collectively. To her surprise, agents contacted her within a week. They met in person, reviewed the evidence, and agreed that the pattern was troubling. They began a quiet inquiry, cross-referencing reports from multiple counties. But the investigation stalled almost immediately. There were no bodies, no witnesses, no consistent crime scenes. Without proof of foul play, the cases remained categorized as disappearances. No alerts were issued. Route 97 stayed open and unchanged, a quiet corridor cutting through pine forests and volcanic plains. Travelers continued to pass through, unaware that so many had vanished there. Patricia still drives the route once a year. She stops at the Chemult station, buys the same brand of coffee her daughter did, and leaves a photo near the register. She speaks softly to clerks who never met Olivia, repeating details that no longer matter. The search, she says, keeps her alive. In another town, under a name slightly altered by the Witness Protection Program, James sometimes sees her picture online. He doesn't know why he looks. He tells himself it's because he recognizes the landscape, the same region where his warehouse once operated. But deep down, he suspects something else. He remembers certain nights when shipments arrived from unknown sources, when the manifests were blank, when sealed containers were removed before sunrise by people who never signed in. He remembers once hearing a hollow noise from inside one of those containers and telling himself it was equipment shifting. He never asked questions. Now, when he dreams, it isn't just the warehouse anymore. It's a car at the edge of a ravine, the smell of coffee, a woman holding a camera pointed toward the trees. He wakes, certain that he has seen her before, though logic tells him that's impossible. He tries to dismiss it as another trick of his damaged conscience. But sometimes, as he drives through his quiet new town, he catches glimpses of a gray sedan in the mirror, keeping distance, headlights dim. And he knows, whether it's memory or imagination, that some things along Route 97 never stop moving. Patricia's determination to keep her daughter's story alive eventually drew public attention. True crime podcasters began to cover the Route 97 disappearances, their voices echoing across forums and message boards. Online communities dissected every lead, arguing whether the truth lay in a hidden predator, a trafficking route, or something stranger still, an explanation lost somewhere between crime and myth. But speculation never brought Olivia home. In 2024, 19 years after her disappearance, Patricia made one last trip down Route 97. She drove the length between Chemult and Klamath Falls again and again, stopping at every station, every turnout, every strip of gravel that overlooked the forest. She photographed the landscape the way Olivia once had, searching for what her daughter might have seen in that final morning light. The more she traveled, the more she realized the danger wasn't limited to one overlook. The highway wound through a geography designed to hide. Deep ravines cut through the forest like open scars. Entire vehicles could vanish without ever being spotted from the road. The land itself seemed built to keep secrets. She returned to the same overlook she'd visited 20 years earlier. The silence felt heavier than before. With permission from the Forest Service, she placed a small bronze plaque on the rock face. It carried her daughter's name, her dates of birth and disappearance, and a single line: "Her light remains in every photograph." The memorial drew others. Families of the missing began leaving their own tokens: flowers, photos, small stones with initials carved into them. Route 97 became an unmarked memorial corridor, its history whispered in podcasts and discussed in late-night threads. Some insisted the disappearances were connected, the work of one or more predators stalking solo travelers. Others argued that the landscape itself was complicit, its depth, its silence, its sheer indifference making accidents permanent. And some, unwilling to accept either explanation, suggested something else entirely. Olivia's camera was never found. Her vehicle never recovered. No blood, no debris, no sign of struggle. Only the certainty that she had gone to capture light, and somehow the light had taken her instead. Patricia still visits the plaque twice each year, once on her daughter's birthday, and once on the day she vanished. She leaves fresh wildflowers, speaks softly to the air, and recounts the months since her last visit, the new cases she's followed, the other families she's met, the lingering absence that ties them together. She doesn't believe Olivia survived. She believes her daughter became part of the place itself, claimed by the forest the way water claims stone. But remembrance keeps her present, suspended between life and loss, in the same light her lens once sought. The Route 97 cases remain officially unsolved. Files gather dust. The road stays open. Travelers pass, unaware that beneath the surface of that ordinary highway lies a chain of vanishings stretching across decades. Michael knew nothing of Olivia when he arrived in the Cascades that September. He was a land surveyor, methodical, grounded in geometry and data, allergic to superstition. His job was simple: map an 80-acre parcel of mixed forest for a logging assessment east of Santiam Pass. The morning was crisp and uneventful. Michael parked at the property gate, loaded his equipment, and began tracing the boundaries. 3 sides of the lot were dense with fir and cedar, but the northern edge looked wrong. The trees there were spaced too widely, the undergrowth too sparse, as if the forest itself had been interrupted. He moved closer. The clearing was roughly rectangular, about 30 by 40 feet, the soil uneven and disturbed. It wasn't the smooth contour of erosion or animal movement. It looked worked, turned over, deliberately, repeatedly. The air smelled faintly metallic and sharp, like a mixture of rust and chemicals. He crouched, touching the soil. The texture was compacted, yet strangely soft beneath the surface, as though something beneath had decayed or been displaced. His rational mind searched for explanations: dumping, illegal burning, construction staging. But none fit. The site was too isolated for heavy machinery, too organized for random dumping. He marked the coordinates and photographed the area. When he stepped back, he noticed faint impressions extending from the clearing toward the tree line. Parallel tracks about 6 feet apart, shallow but visible. Vehicle ruts, long weathered. They ended abruptly at the clearing's edge. Michael's unease deepened. The forest around him had gone completely silent. Even the usual drone of insects had stopped. The stillness pressed on his ears until he could hear his own heartbeat. He took one final photograph and returned to his truck, convincing himself he'd simply stumbled onto an old worksite. That night, reviewing his photos, he noticed something he hadn't seen in the field: a pale, elongated shape just beneath the soil surface, visible through the disturbed dirt in one frame. He zoomed in, thinking it was a root or a rock. But it had symmetry, edges, the curve of metal or bone. The next morning, Michael contacted his employer, reporting the irregular clearing and recommending an environmental review before any logging proposal. He did not mention the photograph. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy visited the site with him. The clearing was the same, except the discoloration was gone. The soil looked freshly turned again, as if the previous surface had been removed overnight. No report was filed, beyond noting disturbed ground, possible illegal dumping. The land changed ownership within the month. Michael finished his assignment, but the images stayed with him. Sometimes he dreams of standing in that clearing again. In the dream, the earth breathes, slowly, rhythmically, and the pale shape beneath the soil moves, just enough to shift the pattern of light across its surface. Michael had never been drawn to stories about the unexplained. He trusted numbers, measurements, and terrain maps more than intuition or superstition. As a professional surveyor, his world depended on precision: angles, elevations, boundaries, coordinates. Everything had a reason. That was why what happened in the Cascades stayed with him long after he stopped working that job. The assignment seemed ordinary at first. 80 acres of mixed woodland outside Santiam Pass, marked for potential logging. His employer wanted an assessment of timber density, access roads, and overall feasibility. Michael had performed this sort of contract dozens of times. He expected a quiet week in the field, a straightforward report, and nothing unusual. He arrived early one Monday in late September. The morning was bright, the air thin and cool. He parked by the gate and began his walk through the property. The southern edge was dense with evergreens, healthy growth, even spacing, just what a developer wanted to see. But along the northern boundary, the forest thinned abruptly. It wasn't the gradual fade of vegetation he'd expect from changes in soil or water levels. It was sharp, deliberate. Moving closer, he found a rectangular patch of ground roughly 30 by 40 feet, where the soil had been disturbed. The earth looked recently turned, uneven in color, and emitted a faint chemical odor, acrid, unnatural. Michael crouched and ran his gloved hand across the surface. The area seemed to have been dug up and refilled several times. He photographed it with his work camera, recorded coordinates, and noted the size. He assumed it might be an illegal dump or chemical disposal site. He'd flag it in his report and let the client handle it. But as he turned to leave, something else caught his eye. A smaller clearing, perhaps 50 feet deeper into the woods. This one was tighter, maybe 15 feet square, but again the ground showed disturbance. Michael's curiosity sharpened. He began sweeping the area systematically, moving through the forest in a grid pattern. Over the next 2 hours he discovered 6 more clearings, all hidden from obvious trails, all giving off the same faint, acidic smell. The arrangement felt intentional. He logged every one, photographs, coordinates, notes. The pattern troubled him. Either the property had been used as a hazardous waste site, or something far more personal had occurred here. He didn't want to dwell on that thought. By late afternoon, he decided to finish the day by surveying the central section of the property, the actual reason he'd been hired. As he pushed deeper into the trees, the forest changed subtly. The air grew heavier, cooler. The light dimmed, even though the sun hadn't dropped much. Branches brushed his arms, snagging his clothes. The undergrowth thickened until every step required effort. He checked his compass, still moving west exactly as planned. Yet the sense of direction that usually came so naturally to him began to waver. The terrain no longer matched the topography he'd mapped earlier. Fallen logs appeared where none had been before. Paths he'd walked minutes earlier were gone, swallowed by brush. Michael stopped to get his bearings. The forest seemed different, denser. He told himself it was fatigue or poor visibility. He'd been working since dawn. But as he moved again, a strange awareness crept over him, the feeling that the woods were rearranging themselves. When he glanced at his compass again, the needle spun erratically before settling on a bearing that made no sense. He frowned, pulled out his GPS unit, and waited for a satellite lock. After a few seconds, the screen displayed his coordinates. According to the map, he was near the northern edge of the property, only about 200 meters from the boundary. Relief flooded through him. He could simply walk south and reach the main road in minutes. He set his course and began moving steadily, watching the GPS readout every few minutes. But after 20 minutes of walking, the coordinates hadn't changed. He was still roughly 200 meters from the boundary. He checked again. Still the same. The realization hit slowly, like a cold wave. He wasn't getting anywhere. Michael's pulse quickened. He forced himself to think logically. The terrain might be interfering with satellite reception. He reset the GPS, waited for it to reacquire the signal, then started again, this time walking in a straight line, eyes fixed on the navigation arrow. He walked for what felt like 40 minutes. Branches tore at his sleeves. His face stung from scratches. The forest was silent except for his own breathing. Finally, the GPS showed movement. The distance to the boundary was dropping. A surge of relief passed through him. He was almost out. But the forest around him had changed again. The trees were ancient now, their trunks enormous, their bark thick with moss. The undergrowth had shifted to ferns and dark, unfamiliar plants. The light was dim, tinted green as if filtered through water. The air felt colder, heavier. He stopped, staring upward. These trees didn't belong here. The property had been logged repeatedly over the last century. No timber this old should exist within its boundaries. He glanced at the GPS once more. The device still insisted he was within the same coordinates. A slow unease took hold of him. Something about this place felt older than the forest he'd entered that morning, older than the land itself. Michael turned off the GPS. For the first time in his career, he abandoned his instruments and trusted only instinct. He picked the direction that felt right, toward openness, toward light, and started walking. He no longer checked his compass or bearings. He didn't stop. After an hour, the trees began to thin. The air grew warmer again. Then, without warning, he stepped onto a dirt road. Across the road sat his truck, parked exactly where he'd left it that morning. Michael stood motionless for a long time, staring at it. His boots were caked with dark soil that didn't match the ground near the entrance. The sun was already low. He'd been gone longer than he'd realized. He got in, started the engine, and drove without looking back. He didn't complete the survey. He filed no detailed report. When his supervisor asked why, Michael muttered something about the terrain being too complex for a single-person crew and recommended hiring someone else. He turned in only a partial data set, excluding all mention of the clearings. Still, he kept the photographs and GPS logs from earlier in the day. The coordinates, the images, the disturbed soil, they remained in a sealed folder in his home office. Occasionally, he thought about deleting them, but he never did. Years passed. Michael eventually convinced himself that the forest had simply confused him, that fatigue and dense growth had distorted his perception. Perhaps the GPS malfunctioned. Perhaps his compass was damaged. He built explanations layer by layer, until the memory became almost reasonable. But sometimes, when he dreamed, he saw that other forest, the one that wasn't on any map. The massive trees, the shifting light, the silence so complete it pressed against his chest. In those dreams, the smell of chemical soil returned, sharp and metallic, and somewhere beyond the trees he could hear something faintly mechanical, like a camera shutter echoing in the dark. Michael had worked for the Highway Maintenance Division for 8 years when the first reports reached his desk. Calls about broken guardrails, lights that flickered even when the power grid was stable, and a hollow sound that sometimes rose from the asphalt itself. He didn't think much of it at first. Oregon highways see worse things than a few bent rails. But that spring, something changed. It began with a stretch near mile marker 243. One morning, a pickup truck was found idling on the shoulder, driver's door open, radio still humming. No one inside. Michael had been part of the cleanup crew. He remembered how quiet the place felt. No birds, no wind, just that thin hum from the radio speaker. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they called it an abandoned vehicle, paperwork, photographs, and then they left. But the unease stuck with him. By summer, the disappearances multiplied. Small ones, easy to overlook. A delivery van missing for 2 days, found locked from the inside. A cyclist who called 911 saying someone was following her but never finished the sentence. Each time Michael filed the reports, each time he felt the same cold weight at the back of his throat. He began driving that route alone in the evenings, saying he wanted to check the repairs. In truth, he wanted to see it, whatever it was. The locals had started calling it the quiet stretch. One night, fog pressed down hard, turning the road into a tunnel of white. Michael slowed his truck, the wipers squealing across the windshield. He saw the faint outline of a figure up ahead, walking along the center line. He honked. No reaction. As he rolled closer, his headlights flickered. The figure turned, and for a fraction of a second, it looked like his own reflection. Same jacket, same work badge, same weary face. Then it vanished into the fog. When he finally reached the next town, his dashboard clock was blinking 3:17 a.m. He had left the site at 11. 4 hours gone. For the next few days, Michael barely slept. He checked his dashcam footage. Static. The onboard GPS log showed his truck parked for nearly 3 hours along mile 243. He didn't remember stopping. The official report said, "Equipment malfunction." Michael filed it, signed his name, and went home. But the next week he quit his job, telling friends he needed a break. He packed his things and moved inland, away from the highway. No one heard much from him after that, until 5 months later, when a ranger found his abandoned truck deep in a service trail off the old route. The keys were in the ignition, the driver's seat pushed back, a half-finished thermos of coffee in the cup holder. The engine was cold. There were no footprints leading away. Investigators concluded he might have wandered off, maybe lost in the woods. But the rangers said the ground was too dry that night for prints to vanish completely. And somewhere between the ridges and the logging roads, the sound of a radio still drifted faintly through the trees. 3 years later, a new name appeared in the files. Emma Clark, a photojournalist from Bend. She was working on a feature about rural disappearances, tracing the same stretch of highway where Michael had last been seen. Emma's colleague said she was methodical, skeptical, not one for ghost stories. She carried 2 cameras, a field recorder, and a notebook she filled with coordinates and times. She even visited the maintenance office, where an older clerk mentioned Michael's name. He kept saying the road was different, the clerk told her. Not haunted, just different. Emma laughed it off at first, but when she pulled the original case files, she noticed something strange. The timestamps on Michael's GPS logs didn't align with the regional power grid's outage reports. 3 hours of darkness that didn't exist anywhere else on record. On her second trip to the site, she parked near mile 243 at dusk. She set up her tripod, started her recorder, and waited. The forest around her was still. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like an approaching storm. At 8:47 p.m., her recorder picked up a low, rhythmic pulse. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 again. She checked her phone. No signal. The hum grew louder, and her camera lens fogged from the inside. She stepped back, breathing through her sleeve, and whispered into the recorder, "If anyone finds this." Then static. 2 hikers discovered her car the next morning. Engine off, tripod folded. No sign of Emma. Inside her trunk, police found her camera bag, and in it, 1 SD card still intact. The first minute of footage was normal. Trees, fading light, the click of the tripod legs. The next minute showed only blackness, punctuated by that same low pulse. At the 30-second mark, a voice, distorted but recognizable, said her name. The voice matched Michael's last recorded voicemail from years before. Locals began calling the area the Rogue Bend Corridor, warning travelers not to stop there after dark. The highway department posted new lights, new signs, and filled the old potholes. Still, every few months, a driver reported the same things: engine stalling, clocks resetting, and a figure seen walking the center line just before the fog rolled in. By autumn, investigators reopened both cases. A joint task force compared signal logs, dashcam failures, and 911 calls. What emerged wasn't proof, just a pattern. Every disappearance occurred within a 5-mile radius, always between 8 p.m. and 3 a.m., and always near that faint radio hum. One technician noticed something even stranger. When they analyzed the sound from Emma's recorder, the pulse frequency matched the old emergency broadcast band used in Oregon before 1978, a frequency officially shut down decades earlier. For weeks, the team tried to trace its origin. The signal came and went unpredictably, sometimes caught by local ham operators, sometimes not at all. The last confirmed recording occurred 2 years later, transmitted for exactly 12 seconds. It said only this: "Keep the lights on." Today, locals still drive that route because it's the only way north, but they do it quickly. Truckers roll their windows down near mile 243, claiming it helps them hear if something changes in the air. The forest there always seems colder, as if the ground itself remembers what happened. The official report on Michael and Emma remains open, filed under unresolved incidents. Both families eventually stopped returning calls, but in the small diner off Route 97, a few old-timers still talk about them, how every story along that road ends the same way, with a stalled engine, a blank clock, and a name whispered through static. They say the highway isn't haunted, it's listening. And sometimes, late at night, when the mist rises off the trees, it answers. The person who had killed Emma remained free, possibly still living in the community, possibly still aware of what they had done. Following the discovery of Emma's remains, law enforcement reopened the investigation with renewed focus. They interviewed people who had known her, combed through school records, and revisited the area where her body was found. Detectives cross-referenced old witness statements against newly available DNA databases, but nothing connected. Despite months of renewed effort, no suspect emerged. Catherine refused to let the case fade again. She had grown older, her hair now gray, her movements slower, but her resolve had only hardened. She appeared on local television shows and true crime podcasts, recounting the last day she saw her daughter alive. She gave interviews to journalists and accepted every invitation to speak publicly, even when doing so meant reopening old wounds. "Someone knows," she would always say. "Someone always knows." In 2018, 31 years after Emma's disappearance, there was finally a break, or at least the illusion of one. A man named Harold Prescott was arrested in connection with an unrelated case involving child abuse. He lived in the same small Oregon town where Emma had vanished decades earlier. When investigators searched his property, they discovered several boxes of personal effects stored in a locked shed. Among them were items that appeared to link him to Emma's case: a blouse and a shoe matching the description of what Emma had worn the day she disappeared. When police confronted Prescott, he denied knowing Emma. He claimed he had bought the items from a garage sale years earlier and had no idea why they matched descriptions from an old case. The denial was unconvincing, but the evidence was circumstantial. Still, prosecutors prepared to move forward. For Catherine, it was the first time in decades she felt that justice might finally be within reach. Before the case could proceed to trial, Prescott was struck by a vehicle in downtown Portland while crossing an intersection at night. Witnesses described the car as a dark sedan that sped away before anyone could note the plate number. Prescott died in the hospital 3 days later. He never confessed. He never faced trial. Catherine received the call from investigators on a Tuesday morning. The officer's voice was gentle but resigned. There would be no testimony, no verdict, no closure, only another unanswered question. Over the following years, Catherine's health declined. She developed heart complications and was hospitalized twice, but she continued to speak at community meetings and volunteer events for missing persons. By the time she passed away in 2023, she had spent more than half her life searching for answers. At her funeral, the community gathered once more. Neighbors, reporters, former detectives, and even young volunteers who had learned of Emma's story through old podcasts. They spoke of Catherine's determination, how she had kept her daughter's memory alive through sheer persistence. But they also spoke of tragedy, the kind of long, quiet grief that consumes a life. Emma's case remains unsolved. The Oregon State Police file still lists it as open, inactive. Over the years, the pages have yellowed. The notes are still there: coordinates, autopsy details, interview transcripts. Most of the officers who worked the case have retired or died. The chances of new evidence surfacing grow slimmer each year. Still, Emma's name occasionally appears in forums, discussed by amateur sleuths who believe Prescott was guilty, and by others who suspect a deeper connection, a link between her disappearance and a series of unreported incidents along the rural highways of Lane and Lynn counties. It is through these discussions that the next story begins. William Price was not connected to Emma's case in any official sense. He was a contractor, a practical man who spent most of his adult life working with his hands. For nearly 20 years, he repaired homes, remodeled kitchens, and built decks for families across Oregon. His work was steady, his reputation solid. Clients described him as reliable, punctual, and honest. He lived alone, rarely socialized beyond work, and seemed content in his solitude. In the spring of 2015, he was hired by a property owner named Raymond Hoffman to renovate an old barn outside a small town in Lane County. The barn stood at the end of a narrow, winding road, surrounded by dense evergreens. Hoffman had bought the property a few years earlier, with ambitious plans to convert it into a retreat center. But his finances had faltered, and now he hoped to rent the renovated barn as a workshop or studio. William arrived at the site early one Monday morning. He parked his truck beside the barn, unlocked the gate, and began assessing the structure. It was large, over 60 feet long, with a sagging roof and walls mottled with decades of mildew. The interior smelled of damp earth and rusted metal. For the first week, everything went as expected. He removed old wiring, replaced beams, and cataloged what needed reinforcement. The isolation didn't bother him. If anything, it helped him focus. But on the 8th day, something changed. He was stripping decayed siding from the northern wall when his crowbar slipped and struck deeper than expected. The wood gave way easily, revealing a hollow space behind it. At first, he assumed it was just a construction flaw, an old builder's shortcut. But when he pried away more boards, he realized the space was deliberate. A concealed cavity, roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Inside, neatly arranged on wooden shelves, were several stacks of old photographs and videotapes labeled with years: 1986, 1987, 1988. William stared for a moment, confused. The photos on top were faded Polaroids showing forested landscapes, road signs, and in a few, what appeared to be faces, blurry, distant, and partially obscured by shadow. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. He carried the nearest box into the open air, letting daylight spill over the contents. The deeper he looked, the worse it became. Many of the photos were of girls, young, some no older than teenagers, posing near the same wooded stretch of highway. None of them were smiling. He stopped going through the box after the first videotape. He didn't watch it long, just enough to see a grainy image of someone standing by a tree, their face turned away from the camera. Then, abruptly, the screen filled with static. William turned off the player, set everything down, and sat on the floor, his pulse racing. There was something profoundly wrong here. He thought of leaving, but another instinct, professional, rational, told him to document what he'd found before anyone else accused him of wrongdoing. He photographed the space, sealed the items back into boxes, and drove to the nearest police station. Officers from the Lane County Sheriff's Department followed him back to the property. By nightfall, the site was crawling with investigators. They cordoned off the barn and cataloged the contents of the hidden compartment. Among the recovered items were nearly 100 photographs and over a dozen videotapes. Some bore handwritten initials on the labels, including one that read simply EH-87. That detail sent a shock through the investigative team. EH matched the initials of a missing person from decades earlier, Emma Hartwell. Forensics later confirmed that one of the blouses seen in the photographs matched descriptions from Emma's case file. The property's owner, Raymond Hoffman, was questioned extensively. He claimed he had purchased the land only a few years earlier and had never explored the barn thoroughly. Records confirmed his statement. The previous owner, however, had been none other than Harold Prescott. The connection was undeniable. Prescott had lived on that property from 1985 to 1992, the exact period when Emma vanished. The revelation reignited the case once more. Investigators revisited evidence long stored away, comparing soil samples and tracking down any remaining relatives of Prescott. It seemed, finally, that Emma's killer had been identified beyond reasonable doubt. But even this resolution felt hollow. Prescott was long dead, the evidence too old for prosecution. DNA samples degraded, chain of custody blurred by time. For Catherine, who had already passed away by then, the discovery came too late. The investigation into the barn revealed other disturbing truths. Several other photographs depicted missing persons from neighboring counties. The tapes, once restored, contained partial footage of what appeared to be interviews, young girls being asked questions by an unseen man. The audio was poor, but one voice, calm and methodical, matched the old recordings taken from Prescott's police interrogation. William never returned to the property after that day. The sheriff's office finished their work, the land was sealed off, and Hoffman eventually sold it at a loss. Local authorities quietly acknowledged that the barn had likely been used as a storage site for materials related to multiple disappearances. For a brief period, Oregon newspapers ran follow-up pieces titled The Barn Files. But the public's attention drifted, as it always does. By the next year, the story had faded into the archive of forgotten tragedies. Today, the structure still stands. The new owners built a fence around it and planted trees to obscure it from the road. Travelers passing through Lane County have no idea that hidden among the trees sits the barn where the answers to a decades-old mystery were finally found. The file now rests in the evidence archives of the Oregon State Police. Emma's name appears one last time on the closing page of the updated report. Her case officially reclassified as resolved by association. No trial, no confession, no justice. Only a conclusion written in black ink. Suspect deceased. Case inactive. Ava Chen was an experienced hiker. She had been exploring the Cascade Mountains and the high desert regions of Oregon since she was a child. Her parents had introduced her to the wilderness almost as soon as she could walk, instilling a respect for the terrain and a knowledge of its challenges. By adulthood, Ava possessed a level of competence and comfort in the backcountry that exceeded that of most recreational hikers. She could read topographic maps with precision, recognize subtle changes in the landscape that might signal a hidden trail, and anticipate weather patterns from subtle shifts in the sky. She knew how to pack efficiently for multi-day excursions, carry enough supplies without overburdening herself, and most importantly, navigate in areas far removed from roads or human settlements. It was in the spring of 2021 that Ava decided to take a solo hike in a remote section of the Willamette National Forest. She had heard reports of unusual terrain patterns and historical logging operations in the area. The forest had sections that had remained untouched for decades, old growth stands interspersed with clearings that had been reclaimed by brush and fallen trees. Her plan was simple: hike for 3 days, document unusual flora, photograph interesting geological features, and return before sunset on the 3rd day. Ava was meticulous in preparing her route and checking her gear. She carried a GPS unit, compass, satellite phone, and emergency provisions. She informed friends and family of her itinerary and expected nothing more than the typical solitude and beauty of Oregon's backcountry. On the 2nd morning of her hike, Ava came across a series of unusual clearings. At first, she assumed they were the result of logging or land management operations. But as she approached the first clearing, she noticed details that suggested human activity beyond routine forestry. The ground was disturbed in patterns inconsistent with machinery, and remnants of containers, plastic drums, small metal boxes, were partially buried in the soil. The smell of chemicals lingered faintly, though she could not identify them. Ava, trained to observe and document, photographed the clearings from multiple angles and marked the coordinates on her GPS. Her curiosity was tempered by caution. Something about the arrangement of the clearings suggested they were intentionally placed, deliberately concealed from casual observation. She decided to investigate further but maintained a safe distance, aware that the area might have hazards. As she moved deeper into the forest, Ava noticed subtle changes in the environment. The trees grew denser, their trunks older and wider than any she had seen on her mapped route. Light filtered through the canopy differently, creating patterns that made distances difficult to judge. The forest floor was uneven, littered with fallen logs, tangled roots, and thick underbrush that slowed her progress. After approximately an hour of navigating through this denser forest, Ava realized that her GPS readings no longer matched the terrain as she remembered it. The device showed her in the same general location, but the clearings she had passed earlier appeared to have shifted. Landmarks she was certain she had noted seemed to be in the wrong positions relative to her route. A sense of unease began to settle in, but Ava relied on her training. She paused to take careful compass readings, retraced her steps in small increments, and double-checked her GPS. Yet, despite her experience, the forest seemed to resist her attempts to maintain orientation. By late afternoon, Ava had entered a section of forest that appeared untouched by modern logging or human interference. The trees were massive, with wide trunks that suggested centuries of growth. Moss and lichen covered much of the ground, and the air was cooler and damp. She realized she had reached old-growth territory, but it was far denser than her maps had indicated. The forest felt different, older, quieter, as if time itself had slowed. Her surroundings seemed frozen, almost suspended. She continued forward, careful to mark her path and photograph each clearing and unique feature, documenting every observation in her field notebook. Among the clearings, Ava discovered remnants of small fire pits, concealed pathways, and evidence of items left behind. Some were innocuous, like bottles, and old camping gear. But others suggested that people had occupied these spaces intentionally and repeatedly. Though she did not encounter anyone, the patterns of placement hinted at regular visits over years. Ava took detailed photographs and notes, understanding that these could be crucial if she needed to report anything to authorities later. That night, she camped in a small opening surrounded by dense trees. The sounds of the forest were amplified in the silence: rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of an unseen animal. Ava felt a deep connection to the wilderness, but she also sensed something intangible, a subtle tension, a feeling that the forest itself was aware of her presence. She tried to push the thought aside, focusing on maintaining her safety and documenting her observations. The following day, Ava ventured deeper, mapping several more clearings with similar characteristics. Soil disturbances suggested digging, but the locations were scattered and obscured. She noted unusual smells that could be chemical in origin, and in some areas, she found remnants of containers or tools partially buried. Ava began to suspect that the site might have been used for activities far removed from normal forest management. Her instincts told her that whatever had occurred here had been carefully concealed for years. Despite the growing unease, Ava maintained discipline. She followed strict safety protocols, avoided unnecessary risks, and ensured she left no trace of her own presence. By the end of the third day, she had catalogued over a dozen separate clearings with distinct signs of human activity. She returned to her vehicle exhausted, but focused on analyzing the data she had collected. Her photographs, GPS coordinates, and field notes would form a comprehensive record that could be shared with law enforcement if needed. Ava later shared her findings with a trusted local historian who had experience with property records and historical land use in the region. Together, they traced the ownership of the land and discovered that several of the clearings coincided with old property boundaries and previous logging sites. Some areas had been abandoned decades earlier, which may have allowed clandestine activities to occur without notice. The historian also noted patterns that suggested human intervention over time: paths deliberately cleared, small shelters constructed, and objects intentionally hidden. While Ava did not find direct evidence of crimes as egregious as those uncovered by William decades earlier, her observations suggested that this section of the forest had a history of being used for concealed activity. She understood that law enforcement might consider these findings significant, particularly in relation to unsolved cases or historical investigations in the region. She compiled her photographs, GPS data, and detailed field notes into a report and submitted it to the local sheriff's office. Over the next several months, law enforcement reviewed her documentation, correlating her findings with historical reports of missing persons and suspicious activity. Though no immediate arrests were made, Ava's observations contributed to ongoing investigations and informed a broader understanding of how remote properties and forests had historically been exploited. Ava herself was profoundly affected by the experience. Though she had not encountered direct danger, the isolation, the strangeness of the terrain, and the sense of hidden histories left a lasting impression. She continued hiking, documenting, and exploring, but she carried the weight of what she had discovered. The forest had revealed secrets, and Ava knew that even the most experienced observer could only glimpse a fraction of what had occurred over decades. Her reports would later be referenced in studies of remote property usage, historical crime patterns, and the potential for hidden activity in rural Oregon. For Ava, the experience reinforced the reality that even familiar landscapes could harbor mysteries, and that the wilderness, while beautiful, could also conceal shadows of human action spanning decades. Ava continued to hike, photograph, and document remote areas, but she remained mindful of the lessons learned in the Cascade clearings. The forests were alive with history, much of it hidden, much of it impossible to fully comprehend. Her meticulous record-keeping, careful observation, and cautious approach served as both a protective measure and a tribute to those who may have been affected by the hidden activities she uncovered. Through Ava's work, a broader awareness emerged among investigators and enthusiasts that remote wilderness spaces, while often viewed as purely recreational, could serve as sites of historical activity, some of it nefarious. Her documentation highlighted patterns that might otherwise have gone unnoticed, preserving knowledge that could prove critical in understanding both past and present mysteries. All had been reported missing by friends or family who had been expecting them to return. Despite intensive search efforts, none of the bodies had ever been recovered, leaving investigators, families, and the community frustrated and unsettled. The 6 missing individuals, David Morrison, Jennifer Hartley, Ava Chen, Robert Santos, Patricia Williams, and Thomas Anderson, represented a disturbing pattern that no local authorities could fully explain. Search and rescue teams had combed hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain, employing helicopters, ground crews, and specially trained dogs. Every trail, canyon, and ridgeline within the Broken Ridge area had been meticulously covered. Yet no physical evidence of the missing hikers had emerged. Their disappearance seemed to defy natural explanation, and theories ranging from accidental falls into concealed crevices to abduction by an unknown party circulated among investigators and locals alike. By 2019, the cases had drawn the attention of independent researchers and true crime enthusiasts. Marcus Webb, a podcaster specializing in unsolved cases, took a particular interest in the Broken Ridge disappearances. He spent months analyzing topographic maps, correlating missing persons reports, and conducting interviews with families and search personnel. Webb noticed that all disappearances occurred in summer months, on clear days, and while hikers were on well-marked trails, often with proper equipment and prior familiarity with the terrain. He identified subtle similarities in the locations of the vanishings, noting that each individual had been last seen near ridgelines or areas adjacent to natural funnels or depressions, where a person could conceivably vanish without leaving a trace. Webb's investigations were widely followed. His podcast episodes, detailed with maps, photographs, and timelines, brought the Broken Ridge disappearances to a national audience. Viewers were captivated and disturbed by the eerie consistency of the vanishings. The podcast highlighted not only the physical challenges of the terrain, but also the possibility of a deliberate pattern. The disappearances did not appear random. Families of the missing individuals began to receive messages from listeners, offering tips or recounting unusual sightings in the area, though none led to concrete breakthroughs. The growing public attention pressured local law enforcement agencies to revisit the cases. Deschutes County Sheriff's Office reopened files on the 6 original disappearances, seeking to apply modern investigative methods and forensic technology. Investigators attempted to reconstruct possible scenarios using computer models of the terrain, analyzing weather conditions, and comparing topographic anomalies across all known disappearance sites. They interviewed local residents, hikers, and workers who had frequented the Broken Ridge area over the past decade. Patterns of suspicious activity were noted: unexplained tire tracks, evidence of temporary campsites, and occasional reports of strangers lurking near the trailheads. But none of these led to identifying a suspect or recovering a missing person. Meanwhile, Independent searches funded by families and volunteers continued sporadically. Specialized equipment, such as thermal imaging cameras, drones, and ground-penetrating radar, was brought in to explore locations that were previously inaccessible. Some areas revealed hidden caves, deep fissures, and overgrown depressions that could explain accidental falls. However, the scale of the landscape, combined with dense forestation and rugged terrain, made it nearly impossible to conduct a comprehensive search, leaving families with minimal closure. In 2023, a private investigator named Sarah Montoya was hired by the families of Ava Chen, Patricia Williams, and other missing hikers. Montoya brought a fresh approach to the investigation, combining fieldwork, historical research, and analysis of criminal activity in surrounding counties. She documented patterns of human activity over the decades, noting abandoned logging roads, isolated cabins, and natural formations that could serve as concealed locations. She cross-referenced local criminal records, identifying individuals with prior histories of assault, abduction, or suspicious behavior in isolated areas. While she could not confirm any direct link to the missing hikers, Montoya concluded that at least one person, potentially more, had exploited the Broken Ridge area as a place to target visitors. Despite these findings, law enforcement faced a persistent obstacle: the lack of physical evidence. Without bodies or definitive forensic traces, the Broken Ridge disappearances could not be prosecuted as crimes. Theories remain speculative, ranging from accidents in treacherous terrain to deliberate abductions by a skilled predator. Montoya's research, however, provided a critical framework for understanding the disappearances, emphasizing that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a recurring phenomenon. Ava Chen's case, as the most widely reported, became emblematic of the Broken Ridge mystery. Her family, especially her mother Lin Chen, continued advocacy efforts, raising awareness of the disappearances through media, social platforms, and public campaigns. Lin Chen emphasized the importance of treating these vanishings as potentially linked incidents, encouraging authorities to apply modern investigative methods and renewed attention to historical reports. The memorial plaque at the trailhead became a symbolic site, drawing visitors who left small tributes or tokens in memory of the hikers, even as the story of the disappearances faded from mainstream news. In addition to investigations and memorial efforts, the Broken Ridge area became a subject of study among geographers and wilderness safety experts. Analyses focused on the combination of rugged topography, microclimates, and trail visibility, exploring how experienced hikers could vanish without trace. Some experts suggested that natural factors, such as sudden rock slides, hidden crevices, and disorienting vegetation, combined with human error, could plausibly account for some of the disappearances. Others, pointing to the pattern and timing of the events, leaned toward the possibility of deliberate interference. By 2024, the Broken Ridge disappearances remained unresolved. 8 individuals had vanished over 14 years, their fates unknown. Ava Chen's name continued to appear in investigative reports, podcasts, and memorials representing the broader mystery. Law enforcement records, independent investigations, and public attention had created a patchwork understanding of the area, but the ultimate truth remained elusive. Families held out hope that advances in forensic technology, renewed searches, or witnesses stepping forward might one day bring answers. The Broken Ridge area, meanwhile, retained its dual identity, a place of breathtaking natural beauty and profound mystery. Hikers continued to explore it, some fully aware of its history, others oblivious. For those who knew of the disappearances, the forest carried an unspoken tension, a reminder that even the most experienced adventurers could vanish without warning. Ava Chen, like the others, remained missing. Her story, a lasting testament to the enigma of the wilderness and the unresolved tragedies that could unfold within it. Despite the decades-long mystery surrounding the Broken Ridge area, local authorities remained constrained by the limits of available evidence. The Deschutes County Sheriff's Office continued to monitor reports of unusual activity, but with no new disappearances for several years, resources were often diverted to more immediate cases. Yet the local community, especially families of the missing, never let the issue fade from memory. Community meetings, online forums, and podcasts ensured that the stories of David, Jennifer, Ava, Robert, Patricia, Thomas, and the two later missing hikers remained alive in public discourse. The Broken Ridge area itself gained a reputation for danger that was rarely officially documented. Experienced hikers who knew of the disappearances approached the trails with caution. They shared advice on carrying emergency equipment, hiking in pairs or small groups, and marking routes meticulously. Some suggested avoiding certain ridge lines entirely, noting that the geography of the region, including hidden cliffs, concealed crevices, and dense forest cover, made it easy for someone to become disoriented or fall without leaving a trace. However, other adventurers, drawn by curiosity or the allure of remote solitude, continued to explore the area, often unaware of the risks or history. Local tourism operators were divided in their approach. Some promoted the area cautiously, highlighting its natural beauty, while advising novice hikers to stay on well-marked trails. Others avoided mentioning the disappearances entirely, fearing that negative publicity would discourage visitors. Meanwhile, online discussion boards and urban exploration websites turned the Broken Ridge area into a point of fascination, with amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts debating the plausibility of each theory. These forums frequently circulated maps, last known locations, and speculative reconstructions of what might have happened to those who vanished. The ongoing uncertainty weighed heavily on the families of the missing. For Ava Chen's mother, Lynn, each year that passed without closure intensified both her grief and determination. She traveled to the Broken Ridge Memorial regularly, speaking to her daughter and reflecting on the unanswered questions. Lynn maintained communication with other families, forming an informal support network that exchanged updates, strategies for independent searches, and information on newly discovered evidence. She also continued to work with private investigators, including Sarah Monontoya, who sought to uncover leads that might have been overlooked or dismissed by law enforcement. The story of the Broken Ridge disappearances also became a subject of broader research into wilderness safety and missing persons. Academics and geographers examined how rugged landscapes, microclimates, and environmental features could contribute to disappearances. Some studies highlighted that even experienced hikers, when confronted with unexpected terrain hazards or weather changes, could become lost or injured in ways that prevented recovery. Others focused on the psychological dimension, analyzing how isolation, disorientation, and panic could exacerbate the likelihood of vanishing in remote areas. These studies often cited the Broken Ridge cases as particularly compelling examples of how ordinary hiking conditions could intersect with extraordinary circumstances to produce tragic outcomes. Over time, media coverage of the disappearances remained sporadic, often renewed only when new investigative efforts, independent expeditions, or podcast episodes brought attention back to the cases. Journalists frequently highlighted the eerie consistency of the incidents. Hikers experienced summer weather, traveled along marked trails, and carried proper supplies, yet vanished completely. The repeated lack of evidence and absence of recovered bodies contributed to widespread speculation and fear. Some stories suggested hidden natural hazards, while others leaned toward the possibility of a deliberate predator. In public imagination, Broken Ridge became almost mythic, a place where the ordinary rules of wilderness hiking seemed suspended, and where the fates of the missing remained unresolved. Despite the fear surrounding the area, the natural beauty of Broken Ridge continued to draw visitors. Alpine lakes shimmered in the sunlight, ridgelines offered breathtaking vistas, and dense forests provided quiet and solitude. Hikers who ventured into the area were encouraged to take precautions, remain vigilant, and never hike alone. Yet the wilderness itself remained unchanged, indifferent to the disappearances. Its trails, cliffs, and forests existed as they had for centuries, carrying within them both stunning beauty and the lingering mysteries of those who vanished. For the families, the unresolved cases created a persistent tension between hope and despair. Each unfruitful search, each investigation that stalled, added layers of frustration and sorrow. Ava Chen's mother, along with other family members, refused to give up, organizing yearly expeditions, reaching out to experts, and petitioning authorities for renewed attention. Memorial plaques, scattered tokens, and digital records served as tangible reminders of the lives lost and the questions left unanswered. The Broken Ridge disappearances remain an enduring enigma. 8 hikers vanished over 14 years, leaving no trace behind. Theories continue to proliferate, from accidents in the rugged terrain to deliberate abductions. Yet no definitive answers have emerged. The area, simultaneously beautiful and treacherous, remains a cautionary tale in outdoor safety, a subject of ongoing investigation, and a source of profound grief for the families. Visitors who pass through may notice the small memorials, but rarely grasp the full history of tragedy that unfolded among the alpine ridges and forests. For Ava Chen's family, and for the others connected to the Broken Ridge mystery, life continues with the weight of uncertainty. The mountains remain both a place of solace and a reminder of unanswered questions. Hikers continue to explore, searchers continue to investigate, and the wilderness endures, holding its secrets tightly. Ava Chen, missing for over a decade, represents both the danger and the enduring mystery of the Broken Ridge area. An unresolved story of disappearance, grief, and the unknowable depths of the natural world. Benjamin's fascination with the piano music persisted well into his later years. Though retired, he found himself returning to the library with increasing frequency, often under the pretense of checking on archives, assisting staff, or reviewing old records. But in truth, he came for the music, the inexplicable, haunting melody that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. On the rare occasions he heard it, Benjamin felt a profound connection not only to Augustus Whitmore, but to the history of the building itself. It was as though the music carried memories embedded within the walls, an echo of lives long gone, frozen yet persistent. Over time, Benjamin began to notice subtle changes in the way the music interacted with the space. On some evenings, it seemed to emanate from the direction of the old vault that had once stored the bank's deposits. On other occasions, it appeared to flow from the grand reading room, the notes hovering in the air before dissolving into silence. The music's onset remained abrupt, starting without warning, and its cessation was equally sudden. The consistency of the melody was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that something beyond ordinary understanding might be at work. Benjamin began to consider the possibility that the music represented more than a simple haunting. Perhaps it was a manifestation of memory itself, a residual imprint of human emotion and activity, preserved in the building's structure. He speculated that Whitmore's passion for music, combined with the intensity of living and dying within the same walls, had somehow left a psychic trace. This trace could be activated by attention, presence, or even the building's ambient energy. The theory gave Benjamin a sense of order in what otherwise seemed completely irrational. Martha, now firmly in charge of the library, occasionally shared Benjamin's quiet fascination, but approached it differently. She did not spend hours attempting to analyze or explain the phenomenon. She simply listened when it occurred, allowing the music to wash over her. Other staff members, and even a few long-term patrons, began to describe similar experiences. A local historian once stopped by for research and reported hearing the music while reviewing old property records in the vault. He described it as eerily beautiful, noting the melancholic undertone and the sense that the building itself was alive with memory. Benjamin took to documenting not only the occurrences, but the emotional responses they elicited. He noted that those who heard the music often felt a sense of nostalgia or longing, even if they had no personal connection to Whitmore or the building's history. Some described a feeling of being transported to another time, standing in Whitmore's apartment while the piano softly echoed in the room. Others reported subtle changes in the temperature, a sudden stillness, or the faint scent of dust and varnish lingering in the air. Benjamin carefully recorded all these details, constructing a comprehensive history of the phenomenon that spanned decades. In addition to the music, Benjamin began to notice small anomalies within the building itself. Occasionally, books would be slightly out of place, or chairs would be positioned differently than he remembered leaving them. There were no signs of forced entry, and security cameras, installed in later years, showed no evidence of anyone moving through the building during these events. Benjamin's journals grew increasingly detailed, cataloging not only the music, but the subtle shifts in the environment that seemed to accompany it. He entertained the possibility that Whitmore's presence, or some lingering energy, was capable of interacting with the physical space in ways that defied conventional explanation. The phenomenon drew the attention of a small circle of researchers interested in unexplained occurrences. Benjamin corresponded with parapsychologists and members of local historical societies who were intrigued by the idea of residual energy manifesting as sound. Some suggested that the building's architecture might amplify or channel certain frequencies, allowing sound to appear without a tangible source. Others posited that human memory could somehow imprint auditory patterns onto physical materials, later triggered under unknown conditions. Despite the variety of theories, no scientific consensus was reached. For Benjamin, the lack of explanation only added to the music's significance. It was both a puzzle and a reminder of the unknown dimensions of human experience. Over the years, Benjamin's own perception of time and space began to shift subtly when he was in the library. During the moments when the music played, he sometimes lost awareness of his surroundings, feeling suspended in a liminal space where past and present intertwined. On one evening, while reviewing records in the vault, the music began unexpectedly. Benjamin described feeling as though he were standing beside Whitmore himself, observing the pianist's careful movements and listening to the notes as they filled the apartment. The sensation was fleeting but vivid, leaving him both exhilarated and profoundly reflective. He recorded the experience in detail, noting the date, time, and emotional intensity. Benjamin also began to explore connections between the music and the library's history. He researched Whitmore's life extensively, poring over newspaper archives, city records, and personal letters that had been donated to the library. Whitmore had been a meticulous man, devoted to art, literature, and music. He had written extensively about his experiences in Harlow, the development of the town, and the importance of creating spaces that preserved both community and culture. Benjamin speculated that Whitmore's attention to detail and deep emotional investment in his surroundings might have contributed to the persistence of his presence in some form within the building. In interviews with local journalists, Benjamin described the phenomenon as a bridge between life and memory. "It's not frightening," he would often say. "It's a reminder that people leave traces of themselves in the world, whether we notice it or not." Whitmore loved music, and in some way, that love lingers here. His comments were met with fascination, though few fully understood the depth of the experience. To Benjamin, it was both personal and universal, a manifestation of human passion enduring beyond mortality, quietly shaping the spaces we inhabit. Even after Martha retired, the music persisted. New librarians and staff occasionally reported hearing it, though they did not maintain detailed records. Benjamin's journals remained a private testament, now preserved in the library's special collections. Scholars visiting the library for research sometimes stumbled upon them, intrigued by the meticulous accounts of music, time, and space. Benjamin's documentation ensured that the phenomenon was not forgotten, offering a rare window into a century-old mystery and the human response to the inexplicable. Benjamin's reflections on the phenomenon grew increasingly philosophical. He considered the nature of memory, presence, and continuity. If music could linger in a space, might other human actions leave similar traces? Might emotions, thoughts, or intentions persist in ways science had yet to understand? He contemplated the boundaries between life and death, reality and perception, and the role of personal experience in shaping one's understanding of the world. The piano music was no longer just a haunting. It was a lens through which Benjamin explored fundamental questions about existence, legacy, and the enduring impact of human passion. Visitors who entered the library rarely noticed the music, but those who did often left changed in subtle ways. Some described a lingering melancholy, others a sense of wonder or reverence. Many returned to the library in search of the music, hoping to hear it for themselves. Benjamin took quiet satisfaction in these small ripples of effect, seeing in them confirmation that Whitmore's presence continued to resonate, shaping experiences long after his death. Benjamin, now well into his 80s, sometimes wondered if the music would ever cease entirely. He acknowledged that one day either he or others who had known the building's history would no longer be present to witness it. Yet he also believed that the phenomenon might endure independent of any observer, as a testament to the intensity of human engagement with life, art, and place. It was a quiet miracle in an ordinary town, a reminder that even the most familiar environments can harbor mysteries beyond comprehension. In his final reflections, Benjamin considered the broader implications of his experience. The library, with its marble countertops, vaulted ceilings, and wooden beams, had become more than a repository of books. It was a vessel for memory, a stage upon which the echoes of past lives could play out. The music, ephemeral yet persistent, symbolized the enduring human desire to be remembered, to leave a mark, to create something lasting. It had inspired him, challenged him, and offered comfort across decades of uncertainty. Ultimately, Benjamin saw the phenomenon not as a threat or a puzzle to be solved, but as a gift. It reminded him that life was layered and complex, that spaces carried stories, and that human passion, when genuine and profound, could transcend the ordinary limits of time. The piano music of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, echoing from an unseen source in a small Oregon library, became a symbol of continuity, presence, and the enduring resonance of a life fully lived. Even now, the music continues to appear, brief and unannounced, in the building that Benjamin loved. Staff and visitors alike occasionally pause, listen, and feel the weight of history settle around them. And somewhere within the walls, Augustus Whitmore's fingers, long gone from the physical world, still seem to dance across invisible keys, reminding all who hear the melody that some echoes never fade, and some passions never die. Benjamin's life, intertwined with the mystery of the library, serves as a testament to the persistence of memory, the resonance of art, and the subtle ways in which human presence can endure long after the body has vanished. The library remains a place of knowledge, of community, and of lingering wonder, a space where the boundaries of reality, memory, and the inexplicable converge, leaving an indelible mark on those who enter. Alexander's life was defined by solitude and routine. The hum of his truck engine, the rhythm of long stretches of highway, and the quiet interludes at roadside diners formed the cadence of his existence. He had grown accustomed to the loneliness of his profession, finding comfort in the predictability of his roots and the mechanical nature of his work. Alexander was diligent, careful, and conscientious. He took pride in his responsibility to deliver goods safely, to follow schedules, and to navigate the unpredictable terrain of the Pacific Northwest with precision. Charlotte, by contrast, lived in a world filled with human connections and emotional intensity. Her studies in social work were not abstract. She had grown up observing the fragility and resilience of families, of children, of individuals struggling to navigate circumstances beyond their control. She was empathetic, perceptive, and determined to make a difference. Her ambition was fueled by a quiet sense of urgency. She had seen enough injustice in her community to know that inaction could perpetuate harm. Charlotte's focus was on prevention, support, and intervention, on finding ways to reach people before trauma became a defining feature of their lives. Their worlds were separate. Yet both Alexander and Charlotte shared a latent awareness of the fragility of human existence. Alexander, through the isolation of long drives and the unpredictability of the road. Charlotte, through the stories of families she sought to help. Neither could have anticipated that the events to come would bind their lives together, drawing them into circumstances that were strange, unsettling, and profoundly transformative. It began with a route Alexander had never traveled before, a delivery into the highlands near Broken Ridge, a region that locals regarded with quiet apprehension. Alexander had heard rumors of hikers disappearing, strange sounds in the wilderness, and reports of people vanishing without explanation. He dismissed them as superstition, the kind of stories that circulated in small towns and were amplified by online forums. Yet there was a subtle unease that he could not entirely shake. The forest was dense, the terrain rugged, and the roads winding. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and the quiet was profound in a way that felt unnatural. Charlotte, on the other hand, had recently taken on a community outreach project focusing on vulnerable youth in rural Oregon. Her research included field visits to small towns and remote areas, attempting to understand environmental, social, and familial factors that contributed to neglect and abuse. One of her stops brought her to Harlow, where she sought information about historical cases of trauma, family secrecy, and community response. In conversations with local residents, she learned not only about contemporary struggles but also about the histories embedded in the landscape. Stories like those of Benjamin and the library, or the experiences of families concealing abuse behind a facade of normality. Charlotte was struck by the recurring theme. Spaces, people, and memories carried weight, sometimes beyond immediate comprehension, shaping behaviors and experiences in subtle, persistent ways. Fates intersected when Alexander, making a delivery near the outskirts of Brokenridge, encountered a vehicle stalled on a remote road. Charlotte was inside, stranded after a minor accident. Alexander helped her get the car running again, and they drove together briefly toward the nearest town. Conversation was cautious at first, polite but perfunctory, but gradually they shared more about themselves. Alexander spoke of the isolation of his work, the peculiar sense of detachment it created, and the strange tension he felt when traversing certain stretches of road. Charlotte mentioned her social work project, her interest in how environmental factors and family history influenced individual behavior, and the haunting persistence of trauma in both visible and invisible ways. The connection between them grew stronger when circumstances required them to confront an extraordinary situation. Alexander, on a delivery route near the old library in Harlow, was forced to take shelter from a sudden storm. He found himself inside the building after hours, the same library where Benjamin had documented the piano phenomenon. As the storm raged outside, he wandered through the aisles and archives, finding the building oddly comforting despite its age. Then, without warning, the familiar notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major began to echo through the library. Alexander froze, unsure if he was imagining it. The music was hauntingly clear, emanating from nowhere, yet every note was precise, melancholic, and profound. Later, Charlotte arrived to conduct research for her project. Alexander recounted what he had experienced. Charlotte, trained to observe without judgment, was intrigued. She suggested documenting the occurrence carefully, comparing it to historical accounts from the library's archives. Together, they pored over Benjamin's journals, discovering the meticulous records of the music's irregular appearances. Charlotte was struck not only by the consistency of the phenomenon, but by its symbolic resonance, the echo of a life and passion persisting beyond death, the invisible weight of history impacting those present. As they spent more time together, Alexander and Charlotte realized that their meeting had catalyzed a convergence of personal and historical threads. Alexander, accustomed to solitude, found himself drawn to a sense of purpose beyond deliveries. He wanted to understand the strange persistence of human presence in space. Charlotte, already attuned to the reverberations of trauma in families and communities, recognized the piano music as a form of residual narrative, a testament to the ways past lives shape current experiences. Their collaboration extended beyond the library. Brokenridge, with its history of disappearances, became a field of exploration. Sophia's advocacy for survivors of abuse and her willingness to confront family secrets resonated with Charlotte's work in social services. Together, Charlotte and Sophia began documenting patterns, listening to stories, and connecting historical accounts with contemporary occurrences. Alexander, who could traverse the landscape efficiently due to his profession, became the bridge between isolated locations and the emerging network of research and observation. What emerged was an understanding that human presence, passion, and trauma do not simply vanish. Whether through music echoing in an old library, as with Augustus Whitmore, or through the hidden scars of abuse within a family, as with Sophia's mother, these forces continue to shape perception, behavior, and memory. Alexander's solitary experiences on the road intersected with Charlotte's social advocacy and Sophia's personal history, revealing an unseen pattern: that environments, whether built or natural, retain the imprint of human experience, and that confronting these echoes requires courage, empathy, and attention. The three of them began to explore these intersections more deliberately. Broken Ridge became a locus not only of mystery, but of reflection. Hikers who had vanished without explanation, like Ava Chen, were approached as case studies of human vulnerability, environmental influence, and the limits of understanding. Sophia's work brought a psychological lens to the phenomena. Charlotte's research provided social context, and Alexander's logistical skill allowed them to access locations and gather first-hand data. Together, they created a framework for considering how spaces, human presence, and unresolved trauma could manifest in ways that were tangible, haunting, and instructive. In the quiet evenings at the library, Alexander and Charlotte would sometimes hear the music together. The notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the air, ephemeral, yet unmistakable. Each time they felt a connection not only to Whitmore but to the broader continuum of human presence. The pain, the joy, the secrecy, and the expression of life preserved in memory. The music became a symbol of endurance, a reminder that even in the face of inexplicable events, human experience leaves traces. Sophia, Alexander, and Charlotte's stories intertwined with the histories of Harlow, Broken Ridge, and the wider Oregon landscape, creating a mosaic of mystery, trauma, and resilience. From Benjamin's careful documentation to Whitmore's lingering presence, from Rebecca's suppressed pain to Sophia's advocacy, and from Alexander's solitude to Charlotte's empathetic research, the narrative reflected the complexity of human experience. It revealed that presence, passion, and trauma can echo long after lives have ended, shaping the spaces we inhabit and the people we become. Together, they continued their work. Alexander driving through forests and highlands, Charlotte documenting patterns of vulnerability and resilience, Sophia advocating for survivors and breaking silences. Each encounter, each observation, each note of the nocturne played in the library became part of an ongoing dialogue between past and present, between hidden truths and revealed stories, between silence and voice. The echoes persisted, in music, in memory, and in human action, reminding all who listened that some presences cannot be erased, that some stories demand attention, and that courage and empathy can bridge generations and mysteries alike. The events of that spring in 2016 marked a turning point for both Alexander and Charlotte. They had entered the world of human trafficking almost by accident, yet the magnitude of what they discovered left no room for indifference. For Alexander, the abandoned buildings had been a curiosity, a distraction during a routine breakdown, a place to pass the time. He had never imagined that stepping through those doors would place him at the center of an operation that had preyed on vulnerable lives for nearly a decade. And for Charlotte, a single phone call from a terrified young woman had forced her into a position where quick thinking and courage meant the difference between life and death. The two of them came from different worlds. Alexander, accustomed to solitude and the linear rhythm of the road; Charlotte, attuned to the emotional currents of human vulnerability and trained to respond with compassion. Yet their paths converged at the intersection of danger, morality, and necessity. Their collaboration, though initially unplanned, revealed not only the scale of the criminal network, but also the ways in which ordinary people could disrupt evil through awareness, action, and resolve. Even after law enforcement intervened and arrests were made, the psychological and emotional consequences remained. Alexander could no longer see the isolated stretches of highway the same way. Every abandoned property, every seemingly empty road now carried the weight of potential horror. Charlotte's work was forever colored by the intimate knowledge of human cruelty and resilience. She understood more acutely than ever the long-term effects of trauma and the fragility of escape. Both carried with them an invisible burden, the faces, voices, and stories of those who had suffered, and the haunting uncertainty of those still missing. Over time, Alexander chose a quieter life. He left the trucking industry and relocated, hoping that distance would provide some measure of peace. Yet the discovery of the trafficking operation remained etched in his memory, a permanent imprint. Each letter, each court appearance, each news story about trafficking victims reminded him that the world's darkness was not abstract. It was tangible and immediate. Charlotte, by contrast, used her experience as a catalyst. She pursued her social work degree, focusing on trauma-informed care and specialized services for trafficking survivors. Her engagement became both professional and deeply personal. She understood that systemic exploitation was not only a criminal matter, but a social one, rooted in vulnerability, neglect, and the failures of institutions to protect the marginalized. Her work became a form of quiet resistance, ensuring that victims received support that transcended immediate rescue and reached into long-term recovery. The bond between Alexander and Charlotte grew out of shared experience and mutual understanding. They met formally at a human trafficking conference, yet their connection had already been forged by the intense, transformative events they had endured. They spoke candidly of the nightmares, the moments of disbelief, and the persistent questions that haunted them. Were all the perpetrators caught? How many victims remained unidentified? Could any of this darkness ever be fully eradicated? Their dialogue revealed a fundamental truth. Awareness alone was not enough. Vigilance, intervention, and ongoing advocacy were necessary to prevent history from repeating itself. The abandoned property, once a site of horrors, became a symbol. Though it had been seized and left to decay, it stood as a physical reminder that evil can exist in plain sight, hidden beneath facades of normalcy or isolation. For Alexander and Charlotte, the site remained an unresolved space, a location that bore witness to suffering, yet could never fully communicate the scale of what had occurred within its walls. Their story also intertwined with the broader human landscape of Oregon. They became connected, albeit indirectly, to the histories of other lives touched by secrecy and persistence, lives like Benjamin's and Sophia's. In the library, the echo of Whitmore's piano continued to play as a testament to human presence beyond death, while in families like Sophia's, the shadows of past abuse reminded them that trauma often lingered unseen, shaping lives for generations. In the case of the trafficking network, the echoes were far more immediate and terrifying. The soundless suffering of victims, the invisibility of their captivity, and the resilience of those who survived. The experience left Alexander and Charlotte forever changed. They had witnessed the worst of human behavior, yet they had also seen courage, intervention, and the possibility of change. They carried with them the knowledge that ordinary individuals could alter the course of lives, disrupt systems of abuse, and provide a measure of hope in seemingly hopeless circumstances. Years later, Alexander sometimes reflects on the abandoned buildings and the fateful breakdown that led him there. Charlotte, meanwhile, continues to work with survivors, ensuring that no voice is ignored, no trauma dismissed, and no system allowed to perpetuate harm. Together, they represent the intersection of action and conscience, of vigilance and compassion. They have learned that uncovering the truth comes with consequences, emotional, social, and physical, but also that silence and inaction allow suffering to persist. Their story, like the echo of Chopin's Nocturne or the revelation of family secrets, is a reminder that human experience carries weight far beyond immediate perception. It demonstrates that courage, observation, and decisiveness matter, that trauma persists unless confronted, and that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, ordinary people can shape outcomes in extraordinary ways. In the end, Alexander and Charlotte's lives are bound not only by the events of 2016, but by a shared commitment to uncover, to protect, and to bear witness. Their experience remains a cautionary tale, a lesson in vigilance, and a testament to the enduring impact of human presence, both cruel and redemptive, across time, space, and circumstance.